So, something I want us to talk about today is about designing with AI as a principle. And I want to share a little anecdote with you. So, yesterday I was having coffee with a fellow designer, and he brought up, well, what is even designing with AI? It's like saying designing with fintech. And my response to him was, it's actually it's actually different than designing with fintech or designing with healthcare or anything for that matter, any specific industry, because designing with AI is actually very horizontal. Designing with or designing for fintech or designing for healthcare, it's very domain specific. But designing with AI is actually a principle that you can use horizontally across any industry. And it's almost like today, in a world where there's so many tools, it's actually like people that have never studied the principles of design calling themselves designers because they can use Canva or because they can use Figma and create shapes. It's more of the principles that you need to really understand. So, Josh, I'm curious, as someone who went to design school, got these like really solid foundations in principles of design, and who has been designing AI products for the last few years at companies like Microsoft, like General Motors. What do you think about this statement of designing horizontally with AI versus designing for AI as a domain specifically?
Yeah, I think that's such an interesting take, and I agree because I think designing for AI is both a horizontal and a domain specific thing. So you have the domain specific learnings about how AI works and how to integrate that into a product in a way that brings value. But then also you have that as a horizontal, like you said, that it could be mixed into any domain specific thing. So you have AI for healthcare and then AI products and their challenges for fintech. And it's very interesting to approach it that way because the learnings that you have for each domain could be domain specific, but also they could be horizontally relevant across any other domains. So that's how the way that we approach it at Flexi AI. We take the things that we've learned across domains that make sense to take when it comes to designing AI products. And we've seen that it works at Microsoft, at GM in the automotive industry, and also at Bria in the healthcare industry.
Okay, but answer me this. I understand the horizontal perspective, and I think a lot of people can argue it's a discipline in the sense that there's principles. And I mean, of course, this is what we're arguing, but like, let's talk specifically about this vertical aspect of like, can you actually compare AI products to fintech, right? Because isn't AI just an application? So, like, to explain that more to me.
Yeah, I think that there's that side of it being an application, but because the challenges that come with AI and especially with LLMs and generative AI are so specific and they also are repeating themselves across industries and across domains, we can sort of build principles that work and are relevant across those domains. And that's when it becomes more than just a tool and more than just the core technology that powers these experiences. And actually, you can approach that and those challenges in a way that through the design process, you give them solutions that make sense. And these solutions, as I mentioned, we've seen and I've seen myself how they repeat themselves across industries. And the way that you approach them is relevant in the same ways.
Okay, but I'm really trying to grasp this here, and I think that all of our listeners would love to understand. And like, let's get like really, really, really specific, right? Because we want to try to parse out the notion of what AI is today in product design and really dissect it to see like where we can make the most impact. Do you think that saying I'm going to create an AI product without something industry specific even makes sense?
No, I don't think it does. I think you have to take into account the domain that you're on as much as the technology that's powering the product and the intersection of those two things through what the user goals are and their pain points in that domain specifically and on the AI side is what really brings and the power of product design and it and the processes that we have of understanding what's the goal of the end user, understanding what affects them, what affects the user experience, and then making the product in a way that answers those needs.
So it actually is pretty horizontal if you think about it, because you can't really have an AI product, right? It's like saying, I'm going to design an application. Great. I'm going to design an application for what? Great that you're going to design a mobile app, but like, what is the use case? What is it for? What industry? What problem is it solving? So actually, I'm going to debate you here, Josh, and I'm going to make the claim that designing with AI really holds a lot of the same principles as when you're saying that you're going to learn design as a discipline and then apply it across industries as opposed to just something that is kind of abstract in concept. I mean, we have these AI tools. It's something that exists, but then it's always followed by AI for what? So when we're thinking about designing with AI in a very similar way that you mentioned, we're thinking about how does it apply to healthcare? Like with the project you're working on with one of our clients, how can you actually reduce the time to query data between two separate users in a way that's actually augmenting the experience and streamlining the experience using LLMs as opposed to doing this all manually? Or when you think about even what we're currently recording on, right? We want to record content, but we want to use AI to find those key moments in the content to provide our end viewers the most value. And so that's actually the application. So if we're not using these principles when we're designing for AI, like you did when you had shared the story with me of when you were designing meeting recap and you were actually looking at the natural behavior of users in meetings and actually emulating and mimicking the AI to find those key moments, which I thought was really brilliant because at the end of the day, you're just repeating human patterns and using technology to augment it. Then ultimately, this abstract concept of designing with AI is indeed what my friend said, which is kind of meaningless. So I would love to hear from you a little bit more about when you worked at Microsoft and when you were working on Meeting Recap, which for those people that are in the dark about the origins of Meeting Recap, Josh will give us more context into that, how you were actually thinking about using AI to streamline and to add value to existing human behavior and ultimately create an augmented experience.
Yeah. So a little bit of context about meeting recap. It's a feature that launched for summarizing meetings, recorded meetings in Teams.
Which is like so crazy, right? Because now like everyone does it, but back then it was
It
pretty
was
novel, right?
new, and today is integrated in almost every workflow. I mean, it's not something that's weird to think about, but back then it didn't exist, and it's not that long ago. And I think that the main learning building recap in Teams is that the technology moves so fast, AI moves so fast, and this all ties into what we were saying about AI being horizontal and the learnings from this domain that is AI and designing for AI being applicable to any other domain. Technology that moves so fast, and you're building a product that can be used and can be prototyped and can be building MVPs with the current technology. But as a designer, you have to think about where the technology will be in half a year, in a year, because it's completely different. And then once you start doing that and start being part of the process of understanding where the models are going as a designer from the user experience perspective, gives you a lot of power. It's like a superpower. That's the way that I think it for a designer to be able to predict where things are going, be up to date with where things are, and not get that as feedback from engineering and have to adapt work that has been already done, and being able to approach the challenges in a way that uses time better, your time as a designer and the time of the team.
Okay, so take me through your workflow because I'm really trying to understand and wrap my head around how to actually design with AI. So you have a user problem, and this is something that in UX design in general, we always start with like, what is the problem we're trying to solve? How is it different when you're designing with AI? Like, what is that workflow and what does that process even look like?
So the way that I was talking about this before is that you have these two roads that intersect at various points. You have the AI road and its own challenges and things that you have to take into account, and then you have the domain specific road. And what's very interesting, for example, in the Teams Recap project, You have the road of how people consume meetings, what's challenging about it, the time consumption, the fact that people are very busy at work and they don't have time to actually go to every meeting that is scheduled. And then on the other hand, you have the other road that I was mentioning, which is the AI challenges one. And then with that comes loading times, comes unpredictable outputs, comes hallucinations. And those two things intersect and start meeting each other, and you have to take to account both things and how they intersect and how the experience is affected by challenges from both ends.
So you used a word, and I want to define it for the people listening because I think that not everyone has heard this word before. You said when you're using AI products, there's hallucination. So what does that even mean? What is a hallucination in AI?
A hallucination is something that the model can make up that is not true, that is just being made up from its general knowledge. But because these models, I'm talking about LLMs here, they're trained to answer to your queries and to always be right. That's their purpose. They're not trained to be wrong or to lie to you, but they want to give you answers even if they don't have them. They'll have a very hard time telling you that they don't have an answer, especially in the past. Today, models have evolved a lot, but I'm talking about when we were building Teams Recap. It was a while ago. And we're just speaking about how fast this moves. So it's insane to think about the
Yeah, like
huge.
when was that? Like two or 3 years ago it came out? It's wild.
So back then, the amount of hallucinations, of lies that the models would come up with to fill up these gaps in knowledge would be a lot more significant than today. It still happens. I mean, all of the models still hallucinate, but it used to be one of the main concerns about the user experience back then. Today, I think it's taking a bit of a sidestep to the other problems.
So is this something we still see in product design? Do we still see hallucinations? Is that a reality that we're facing today?
Yeah, definitely. I think the tricky part is not the models have gotten a lot better and hallucinate a lot less, but the tricky thing is that they have gotten better at hiding their hallucinations and at giving reasons and giving explanations about why they came to conclusions that are wrong. Especially with the newer models that are reasoning models, it gets very complex easy because for you to pinpoint a hallucination, you have to actually go through the reasoning and understand what was wrong about the reasoning, not only the end result.
And that's so interesting because LLMs and generally using AI models, it's a black box, right? Like we understand the input, we see the output, but we don't really know what's actually happening inside of these neural networks that are processing this information. And so it's wild because you talk about the reasoning, but we don't always have the reasoning. Like one of the ways that, for example, OpenAI could possibly show some of the factors of how it got to that is, you know, contextually giving some explanation. I remember I, the other day, asked ChatGPT, am I married? And because I had used ChatGPT so much for my wedding website and like my wedding invitation, I was asking like, what's a better date in Mexico, in Tel Aviv, because I was considering all these different locations for the wedding. ChatGPT actually outputted to me, oh, we know that you're planning a wedding to Mark and actually use the name of my now husband because it saved that memory. But did you get married? Like it didn't actually know, but it gave me the reasoning behind why it would guess that I possibly was married. And then I told it, yes, I am. And it said, congratulations. And it was really fun. We had this back and forth banter with this AI machine. But I remember when I was at booking.com and we were designing AI products, the best we could do was say, hey, we gave you this recommendation, or we're giving you this recommendation for this destination as somewhere you'd potentially want to add on to your trip. But we could only really tell it because you went to Athens, we're guessing that you might want to go to Mykonos next. Like we didn't give it all that context. And we couldn't really, even if we had that information, because there's only so much room on a screen, and you actually do have to balance the visual design aspects, the user experience aspects with all this information that you potentially have or don't have with AI. So I'm curious to hear from you, Josh. Like you worked at Microsoft, you worked at GM, and you were really there while all these LLMs were becoming more commercialized. And while we were still as designers figuring out how to use AI in UI, like what were some of the considerations that you would take into account when you were thinking how much context to give the user, or how much explanation to give the user while balancing strong visual design?
That's a great question. And it really takes me back to a project that I worked on at GM when I was just starting. We were working on integrating LLMs into answers that the car provided to natural language questions. So the way that it would work before the LLMs is that you'd ask a question and you get back a sort of a search results type of thing. And then what we wanted to do is to integrate GPT into the experience so you could get actual answers that use the content as opposed to just performing a search, use that content to answer the question in a way that's both answering directly to what you asked and also be more concise and sort of collapse the amount of effort that it takes for you to get to an answer. And then long story short, what happened is that I understood that the answers that we were getting from GPT were very long. And we started a bit of a work process to understand why we needed the answers to be that long. We understood that the answers, when we shortened them, they'd become less accurate. So the percentage of answers that would be answered wrongly would increase if you shorten the answer. This ties into what you asked because it's how much context do you want to expose the user to? And the solution that we came up with, which is a bit of a hack, if you will, is to output two answers from that same prompt that we were using, one short one and one long one. And then the short one we'd read out and allow the user to go into the full context of the answer, which is that second answer that's a longer one. And the user could just take that action to go into the full context.
So it's interesting because we're always balancing, right? We're balancing context with clarity, with clean design. And what I'm really interested to get from you, and I know that you're going to publish this for people to see, is what are some of those considerations? What are some of the questions to ask yourself? And are there any right answers and paths and tools and resources that designers and startups can use when they are designing and creating AI products? Like, let's get really tangible here. Like, what are some very actionable steps that we can take?
I think the main thing that people have to take into account when designing products, and this is product design in general, right? But I think this is specifically powerful when you're designing for AI. And I'll say why, but first I'll say what it is. To always use user needs and the end user, their goals, their pain points as a guiding star to whatever choice you're going to make. And the
Like the
why,
North Star, like this is our North Star, this is where we're going.
with today's technology and Gen AI and LLMs and where they're at today and where they will be in a couple of years, you can do anything. You can do a lot of things. There's an infinite amount of things that you can build and do. You can get lost in that as a designer. It's easy to just get lost in the amount of value that you can provide. And what really helps you drill that in, be very focused on what it is that you're building and why, is to go back to the user needs, go back to the pain points, go back to the user goals, and always check throughout the process, are you building something that's actually providing value and why?
Okay, well, that's great advice. Thank you so much for this, Josh. And I can't wait to see the resources that you put out for us.
Thank you, Ali. This was great.